Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Hillard from the University of Southern Maine. I'm the organizer of 3 sessions today on the topic of financialization, corporate governance, and labor. That includes this plenary and 2 sessions that follow immediately at 12:15 and 1:30. As most in the audience are aware, of the past 40 years, the prevalent ideology of corporate governance in the United States has been what might be called financialization, anchored by both shareholder primacy and the parallel practices of private equity. Success of this ideology and its practices have transformed corporate strategies, often destroying productive capacity, future growth, and jobs with it, while contributing powerfully to the dramatic growth and inequality of wealth and incomes, especially but not only through the fissuring of US labor markets. So altogether, financialization has been a direct, major and ongoing cause of deteriorating labor market outcomes and deteriorating opportunities for voice for American workers since the 1970s. Now, many key researchers in LERA with a very high profile, and I'm thinking here of Eileen Applebaum and Rosemary Batt, Tom Koken, Paul Osterman, David Weil, and Sandy Jacoby, among others, but they're the leading names, I think, have made powerful contributions to research on this topic that will be revisited and amplified today in our 2 sessions after the plenary. Our plenary today features 2 economists from beyond LERA who have built a deep and important base of institutional, historical, and comparative research on financialization, its links to the debasement of employment and rising inequality, and they've produced a robust policy agenda, which will be represented in the plenary, to both restrict the abuses of rising inequality and profoundly increase worker voice in corporate governance. I'm speaking here of William Lazonick and Lenore Palladino. Please, they're going to introduce themselves when they come on, but please let me give a shout out to their Academic Industry Research Network, which is a go-to source for research and commentary on the subjects we'll be discussing today. So I invite all of you to participate in all 3 events today, to learn from existing and new research, to learn more about recent or current policy proposals and historical perspective on financialization's impact on workers. And also how to reform corporate governance with workers and society in mind. So let me turn now to our plenary today, which focuses on Senator Tammy Baldwin's Reward Work Act proposal. Our keynote is a leading co-sponsor, Congressional Representative Jesús Chuy García, who I'll fully introduce in a moment. Just a word on the format of the plenary. We're going to start with Congressman Garcia's keynote, followed by 2 questions from our panelists for the Congressman. Then there'll be brief presentations by Professors Lazonick and Palladino, and then we'll have time for audience reaction and discussion. So let me turn to a fuller introduction of Congressman Garcia. U.S. Representative Jesús Chuy García proudly represents the 4th District of Congressional District of Illinois. He's a co-sponsor of the Reward Work Act. He's a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the Congressional Equality, Pro-Choice, and New Americans Caucus. Throughout his career, Congressman Garcia has been a strong progressive voice, both as an organizer and as a legislator, fighting to improve the lives of his working class neighbors, many of whom are immigrants like him. He's a coalition builder, committed to expanding access to quality education, affordable housing, and especially economic opportunity. He is also the founder of the Future of Transportation Caucus. Congressman Garcia still lives in the Little Village neighborhood where he was raised with his beloved wife, Evelyn, and 3 adult children who made him a proud grandfather. Please welcome Congressman Chuy Garcia.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I, of course, much appreciate the opportunity to help open up the discussion. I'd like to recognize, of course, the Labor and Employment Relations Association for their research and efforts to advance labor and employment issues. I'm very proud to share that I've spent my life standing in solidarity with working people in Chicago and around the world for labor rights and for a voice in the workplace. As many of you know, I represent a working class district. My constituents are the hardest hit by inflation, supply chain shortages, and the pandemic. In recent weeks, we've seen news on a national baby formula shortage. The largest infant formula manufacturer in the US, Abbott, announced massive recalls of their formula and a temporary closure of their plant in Michigan, which I saw on the news this morning. They have resumed production, apparently, all of which have contributed to the infant formula shortage that we see today. While just last year, the company spent over $800 million to purchase over 6.5 million shares in stock buybacks. The money spent on its stock could have been used to invest in safety or training. Instead, corporations are prioritizing profits over safety and public health. Shortages like this impact, of course, working class communities like mine across the country. And prior to the pandemic, I've been engaged in the stock buyback issue for quite some time. In the last Congress, I introduced the Reward Work Act, which eliminates the SEC safe harbor that allows corporations to buy back their stocks and requires that companies allow workers to elect 1/3 of the company's directors. I plan to introduce this legislation soon, and I'm happy to share that my colleague, Senator Baldwin, also plans to reintroduce the bill in the Senate. As we've seen with Abbott, buybacks are not only bad for consumers, but they destabilize our whole economy and directly impact our workforce. Buybacks allow companies to spend money directly on raising their share price instead of investing in their employees or training. In 2018, General Motors announced that it was cutting 14,000 jobs, part of what led to the UAW strike in 2018. The cuts were supposed to free up $6 billion in cash, but the company had spent almost twice that on stock buybacks in the last 3 years. But General Motors is far from the only example of companies that pay off their shareholders while cutting jobs. And the incentives for executives to raise share prices instead of investing in the workforce is huge. In the last decade, 82% of pay for executives for Fortune 500 companies came from stocks, and activist investors like hedge funds, in cases like GM and AT&T, add further pressure on management to spend money on buybacks instead of investment. All the while, many share buybacks are paid for with debt, in particular, leveraged loans, putting our country at risk. The Reward Work Act also puts workers on the board of publicly traded companies. This creates an important structure for workers' voice within the corporation itself and accountability of management. It means that the CEO will be accountable to workers and not just profits. Due to these corporate practices, consumers are left with purchasing essential items at high cost, and workers are vulnerable to losing their jobs. All the while, corporations spend their profits on stock buybacks to boost their share price and pay off the shareholders. Now is the time for Congress to take much needed action to stop corporate greed and protect our workforce and vulnerable communities. I'm eager to move this important piece of legislation forward and want to thank everyone who is on the call today for taking the time to discuss this critical topic. Now I will pass it back to Michael to open up the conversation for questions. Thank you.
Bill Lazonick, you want to go next?
Yeah, well, I just had one question for the Congressman. I think Lenore does after that. And then when I give my remarks, I'll say more about myself a little bit. Right now, the SEC, for the second time since Rule 10b-18, which is the rule that allows all these stock buybacks, which was adopted by the SEC in 1982, it's only the second time they've had it open for public comment since then. And but the main focus is on more disclosure. Because quite rightly, since even after the fact, we don't know what days companies do buybacks, it's a great opportunity for insider trading. Now, I'm not against that, but my fear is that should maybe be a first step in getting rid of Rule 10b-18, but it might be the last step, and it might just legitimize stock buybacks to say, okay, you disclose them, then are okay. And I just wonder what you think about that in terms of legislation?
Well, while disclosures may curb some insider trading, reforming the 10B-18 rule rather than banning it would only allow companies to continue stock buyback practices. Disclosures are not enough to prevent job losses and supply chain challenges that result from major stock buybacks. In addition, disclosures will not incentivize corporations to invest in their workforce or training. As a result, the same communities and employees of these corporations will continue to be negatively impacted by stock buybacks, regardless of disclosures, thus the need for a ban.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman. Those were wonderful remarks, and thank you for all your leadership on these issues in Congress. And so if we have a minute, I want to actually ask you two questions, and you can sort of take them as you wish. The first is really just, to widen the aperture a bit, when you think about issues of corporate power, how do you think about these issues affecting your constituents in Chicago? How do we think about shareholder primacy and financialization as a racial justice issue, as a economic inequality issue writ large, in addition to the specifics that you've so eloquently given? And then secondly, I wanted to ask you to speak about the other portion of the Reward Work Act, which is about the idea of worker representation on corporate boards, and why to you in your leadership role in Congress, why that seems like something worth promoting. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And look, my answer is very direct. I live in a working class community. I live in the barrio. I've lived in the barrio since I came from Mexico. And these are my neighbors. They're working class folks who don't make high wages, who struggle to make ends meet, and who are striving to do better for their families. I mentioned a few major news stories that showed the real impact of these things. The formula shortage layoffs, currently in the news every day. And the fact that the relentless focus on payoffs to shareholders instead of investment in workers has gutted this country's economy. Executives aren't just ignoring their employees' best interests, they're abandoning their own companies' products to give a quick buck to the shareholders. It's a short-sighted, and it affects us all. I just want to add as well that one of the new chief co-sponsors who's raring for me to reintroduce the bill in this Congress is the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Peter DeFazio. Why? Because he's seeing all of the damage that's being done to our manufacturing sector, to many other companies for simply greed and increasing increasing profits from companies and damaging those companies and not investing in their workers or in safety. To your second question about why representation on boards with a ban on share buybacks. This bill, aren't they different issues? And of course, this bill is about corporate governance, and it's about executives boosting investment instead of lining their own pockets. Corporate boards need a voice that's committed to the long-term success of the company, somebody who stands to benefit from investments in growth and innovation. There's no better voice for ongoing investment than the company's existing employees. So I think this combination makes perfect sense. And when you see the renewed organizing in labor, this is a wonderful time to make this happen. This will help ensure greater prosperity and mobility for working class families all over the country.
I'd like to take a moment to say that we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule. So if one or two members of the audience would like to ask the Congressman a question, I would entertain them. You just turn on your mic and speak. Anyone?
I'll ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, it's Wilma Liebman. And my question goes to some of the, not so much criticism, but commentary about worker representation on corporate boards where workers really have only a minority vote. And what you see and how you articulate the value of workers being on a board, even if only in the minority.
I think that workers being on boards is an empowering step forward for them, for organized labor. I think workers' voices can help ensure greater transparency in the condition of corporations. I think it brings a level of justice and of leveling the playing field. It certainly doesn't address matters of unionization and matters of wages, but I think it's a step forward. It is empowering, and it plays a positive role forward. If you consider all of the dynamic organizing that's going on across the country, across different sectors of the economy, as we consider onshoring manufacturing back in our country, in Mexico, in Canada, it offers great opportunities for ensuring that the wage differentials in these countries will begin to get equalized, and that we move toward a greater sense of fairness and justice. The organizing that's going on in Mexico, the important steps that have been taken to guarantee workers' rights there in open and fair elections is one of the most exciting things that's happened in that country for a long time. And there will be, I think, spin-off effects in the Northern Triangle in Central America as well. That's why it's a step forward. It's part of workplace democracy. And I think it will help energize the labor movement toward greater fairness and, again, leveling the wage differentials in these regions of North America and Central America.
Thank you for that. Can I ask a quick follow-up? Are you finding a lot of interest coming from organized labor for this measure?
Yes, unions, generally, and I think overwhelmingly support this. They see it as an important step forward, and they're supportive.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I can take one more question from the audience.
I have a question.
Rose?
Teresa, it's Teresa.
Oh, Teresa, I'm sorry.
I have a really bad
Go ahead,
cold.
Teresa.
Hi, Representative Garcia, it's very good to see you. I helped work on your mayoral campaign around pension issues. So
Thank you.
I'm glad you're in Congress. I was a Teamster representative on a Fortune 100 board of directors. The Teamsters bargained away a lot of pension benefits, but they got, with that bargaining, a representative on the board. And my role was a little bit more prosaic, but I think important. I had to remind the private equity representatives on the board that the workers owned their rolling stock and had access to their real estate, to their warehouses. And that if they stopped their pensions and filed for Chapter 7, I could not guarantee that the valuation we put on the trucks and the warehouses would be valuable, because a Teamster once took a chainsaw to a Perry-built and destroyed the property. And I had to do that 268 times. Almost every single meeting, I had to remind the private equity folks what they learned in business school, just file for bankruptcy and vacate the benefits, wasn't going to work.
Well, that's why we need greater workplace democracy. This is one way to ensure it. Let's remember that the prime beneficiaries of buybacks are the senior corporate executives who, with their stock-based pay, make the decisions to allocate corporate cash to shareholders, as well as hedge fund managers who are in the business of timing the buying and selling of corporate stock for stock price gains. So Rule 10B-18 gives these predatory value extractors a particular advantage because a company is not required to disclose, even after the fact, the amount of buybacks done on any given trading day. So buybacks do not benefit the average consumer or employees, and that's why we need to ban stock buybacks.
So that's a wonderful insight. Rose Spat, if you're still there, we've got time for a question from you.
So I want to follow up with Teresa, and thank you for being here, Representative Garcia. I think our focus on corporations is important, and the legislation you're featuring is really important. I'm also struck that the ways in which finance capital, Wall Street finance actors in particular, such as Wall Street and hedge funds, are represented all over our government. Their lobbying is fierce. We know that with, for example, the Surprise Medical Billing Act, the Ban the Bill, private equity poured millions and millions into trying to defeat that, et cetera. So what do you see as the way forward in reining in, this finance capital, which is really, a cousin to corporations, but still increasingly powerful and a different actor. And frankly, many Democrats, think that private equities are fine.
Yes, there is a sector of Dems who believe that. I, of course, am not one of them. I think it's really important that measures like this help educate people about how they gain more control over the increasing corporate dominance in Washington, in state legislatures, and all of the propaganda about how great private equity and their capital is, losing sight of the predatory impact that they have, the race to the bottom, and encouraging corporations to become low road actors instead of responsible corporations that invest in their workers, who care about their safety and that respect workers' right to organize as well. You've been seeing recently that stock prices have been very volatile. They move based on economic conditions, or in the case of GameStop, for example, last year, very particular circumstances. So it's important to remember that share buybacks haven't been around forever. And in fact, the CARES Act recently temporarily stopped buybacks in crucial industries like banking, and share prices went up and up. So if anything, my bill will improve the real value of companies by aligning executive incentives more with the success of their company. This is an important tool to educate employees and workers about what kinds of tools they need to have greater control of the economy in their fight to make our economy fair and one that provides greater prosperity to workers everywhere.
Wonderful insight. Sandy Jacoby, I'm going to extend it for one more question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I just wanted to follow up on Rosebot's question. Of course, everything that you're doing, I think, is great, focused on public corporations. But in the financial markets, in the financial sector, as she said, there are issues with private equity and with hedge funds. And there were attempts in the past to reform the carried interest taxation problem, which is responsible for the phenomenally high compensation of people in private equity and hedge funds. And is that on the agenda anywhere?
It is on the agenda with some members of the Financial Services Committee, but I think the economic fate and the negative turn that we're experiencing with inflation has given many Democrats real worries about reelection and are, I think, taming their natural instinct to fight for greater fairness and justice. The midterm elections and the historical trends in that regard, I think, are making more and more members a little bit more afraid not to rock the boat too much. I am eager to get these elections behind us so that we can have greater clarity and continue to move forward, helping people understand the control that international capital is having over their lives and why we need to fight for ordinary people in committees like the Financial Services Committee of Congress, in Ways and Means as well, to ensure that we've got a shot at leveling the playing field and ensuring greater prosperity for workers everywhere.
Thank you, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, sir.
So I'm going to wrap up this part of the program with what I think is a brief question. Yes, that's Sandy Jacoby's book and Teresa's picture there. And that is, Congressman, could you just sort of tell us the state of interest in the caucus? And then secondly, what could this group of labor scholars and activists do to support the Reward Work Act?
Yes, I think there is a lot of interest in the Democratic caucus for people who have expertise and research and data to advance arguments that help working people, low-income people, and especially in the big fight around the way forward, given the economic turbulence that we're experiencing in the economy. And it's a complicated set of factors that I think are producing the inflation and some of the other dynamics that we're seeing. Certainly coming out of the pandemic has created lots of turbulence. The shortages, our inability at times to understand that these dynamics are taking place worldwide and not just in the US. The easiness to blame the Biden administration for everything that's going on. And then, of course, the war of aggression by Russia on the people of Ukraine and the resources that we've had to designate, and I've been a big supporter of that in Congress, but we need perspective and we need to have a path forward that enables us to effectively communicate with ordinary people in our country and especially in red states to enable ordinary people to be able to understand basic economics, what is in their self-interest, and to help them see beyond the misinformation and the talking points of a party that simply wants a majority, that's willing to sacrifice democracy and engage in all of the hateful rhetoric and irresponsible positions that are being put forward by the minority party at this time as it seeks to win majorities in both houses in the upcoming elections.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Garcia. We thank you for taking the time to join us today. We thank you for your commitment, your eloquence, and your passion on this subject. It's been great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to see everyone. Have a great day.
Okay. Turn to the second part of the plenary now, and we'll lead off with Bill Lazonick.
Yeah, I also appreciate Congressman Garcia's advocacy of these issues. So I just want to make some key points, at least what I think are key points about why we should rescind Rule 10b-18 and have workers on board for essentially support the Reward Work Act. The first point, which I think is in many ways most critical, is that the earnings that a successful company retains are the basis of capital formation, including, first and foremost, investing in human capabilities, which basically are the capabilities that can give a firm a competitive advantage. They're the essence of innovation. The conventional wisdom, the neoclassical theory of capital formation, is just money whizzing around through financial markets somehow ends up in capital formation. And that was the thinking behind the adoption of Rule 10b-18 in November 1982. It's still on the website of the SEC that they support capital formation. It undermines capital formation. Some advocates of buybacks, they'll say, oh, the money goes somewhere else in the economy along these lines. It just whizzes through the economy, somehow ends up in capital formation. For example, venture capital. Well, there's never been a shortage of money for venture capital since July of 1979, when the Labor Department clarified ERISA and said that pension funds could put a proportion of their money into venture capital and other risky assets. And there's been a shortage of good companies to build and to invest in. Those companies, when they're built and they're successful, they retain and reinvest, but a lot of them then start doing lots of buybacks. And it's really the most successful companies that are doing most of the buybacks, but they're the ones on which we rely to create more good jobs. So trillions of dollars from buybacks have concentrated income at the top. I would say, I think it's the primary reason for growing income inequality. And I referred you to my book, Predatory Value Extraction, which came out 2 years ago with James Shin, where we go through the economics of this. Buybacks have also decimated the US middle class. I think there's nothing more that has led to a lack of investment in the working class than the companies, successful companies, just giving their money to make people richer. It's critical that Congressman Garcia mentioned the safe harbor. The SEC has never argued that buybacks are not manipulation of the market. These are buybacks done as open market repurchases. That's what's regulated, so-called, by 10b-18. It just gave companies a safe harbor and said that if you do less than 25% of your average daily trading volume over the previous 4 weeks on any single day, we won't call it manipulation. You'll be free from having charges of manipulation, and we won't assume that if you go over that amount, that you'll necessarily be charged with manipulation. And in fact, as we've already discussed, they don't even disclose how much they do on any particular day. Now, this means that companies that do a lot of the buybacks can do hundreds of millions of dollars per day, trading day after trading day, on buybacks. Apple, which is by far the leading repurchaser ever, can do, under this rule, $2.5 billion in buybacks per day, trading day after trading day, without being charged with manipulation. Okay, the prime beneficiaries, as the Congressman said, are corporate executives and hedge fund activists. And Sandy Jacoby mentioned private equity. I think was very important, but it's important to know that the hedge fund are the ones who are pushing buybacks of public companies. And many of those public companies actually get into trouble, then they become targets for private equity. So there is a relationship. Buybacks are different than dividends. This is very important to understand. Dividends are given to shareholders who buy and sell shares on the market and hold shares for holding the stock. Buybacks reward stock traders for selling the shares, including top executives, including hedge fund activists. Okay, now last year in 2021, stock buybacks were in excess for the S&P 500 companies of $850 billion, which is a record level. It may be surpassed this year. And I should say this is despite the fact that when he was vice president, Joe Biden was an ardent opponent of stock buybacks and wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed in September 2016 against buybacks in its relation to executive pay. I've done at the Academic Industry Research Network, where I am, which I've been running for the last 10 years. I'm now also a professor of economics emeritus, UMass. We've done lots and lots of studies of particular companies to show the impact of buybacks. So I'll just mention a couple. Boeing, the congressman mentioned Peter DeFazio. I'm sure that his support of the Reward Work Act comes out of the investigation that he led on Boeing, because Boeing did $43 billion in buybacks from January 2013 to the week before the second 737 MAX crash in March 2019, knowing that they were producing unsafe planes. And in fact, they were doing those buybacks based on projected future profits from selling the planes, which actually didn't materialize. General Electric is a company that's being torn apart by a hedge fund activist, Nelson Peltz and Private Partners, who has his son-in-law, Edward Garden, on the board. Peltz has never had more than 0.9%, 0.9% of the shares of GE. Yet he has his power to really wreck GE, split it apart. Again, you can go and read some of the things I've written on this to find out why. Cisco Systems, which I'm finishing a paper with colleague Marie Carpenter, they've done about 150 billion of buybacks since 2002. And in the process, we do not have 5G capability in the United States. They were the best position to do so. The leader in the world is Huawei from China, which is not on the stock market. I could go on, companies in the pharmaceutical industry, et cetera. Okay, the arguments for employee representation, very quickly. Employees are value creators, and their skill and effort generate the profits that companies make. It's not shareholders. And when people call shareholders investors, public shareholders, they are not investors. They're just people like you or me can buy and sell shares. Warren Buffett has bought between 2016 and 2018 about 37 billion in Apple shares. Not 1 cent went to Apple. Yet by Apple doing record-breaking buybacks, 84 billion in 2021, Warren Buffett last January was $120 billion richer, at least Berkshire Hathaway was. These are not investors. They are just value extractors, what I call predatory value extractors. Okay, but employees are the value creators. And so we got it all wrong when you talk about maximizing shareholder value. Okay. Employees take way more risk than shareholders. If you and I buy shares on the market, we can click on a mouse, get rid of those shares. Employees depend upon their future on the companies. And if you want them to work hard and smart, you want them to be worried about the future of the company. Yet you can lay workers off at any point in time. They're bearing a huge amount of risk. Okay, the experience of worker representation on corporate boards is very strong. Certainly the German system of co-determination shows that the strength of worker co-determination. What is critical to the success of the German system is that workers are involved in works councils at the plant level. And when they are representing workers on supervisory boards, they know what is going on with the company. They are well educated in what the company is doing and in its strategy. Now, in the United States, actually, the main way in which managers have power is through common law, the business judgment rule. And in fact, most issues of business judgment are not open to shareholder vote at annual general meetings in the United States. But the board does oversee and monitor and assess business judgment. Now, who better to assess business judgment than workers? Certainly not the people who are on boards now who just are pushing for more buybacks. Okay, so the US law does not require shareholders to be represented on boards. The very fact that common shares even have votes, which is because in around 1927, after the New York Stock Exchange had been attacked in a book by William Ripley, a Harvard economics professor, called Main Street and Wall Street for giving too much power to managers, the New York Stock Exchange, a bunch of rich white men got together and said, okay, let's have common shares have votes. By that time, the separation of shareholding from control was far enough along that it really didn't matter. And finally, the US proxy voting system, what puts people on boards, is totally corrupt. Basically, I gave the example of Nelson Peltz and GE, but I could give examples of people like Paul Singer, Daniel Loeb, Carl Icahn, William Ackman. These people are with virtually no shareholding in a company, ripping a company apart. And I'll just end by saying the reason Apple, since October 2012, has done $506 billion in buybacks. despite the fact that the only time they ever raised money from the stock market actually was in their IPO in 1980, $97 million, is so Tim Cook can stand on the board. So Al Gore, who's one of the longest serving board members, can stay in control of the company. It has nothing to do even with them making money, because they're super rich. It has to do with control, and the control is actually in the hands of a small number of people. And I would say, after we get the Reward Work Act, we've got to go after the hedge fund activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill Lazonick. Lenore Palladino.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay, I'll be brief. So first of all, I just want to thank you, Michael, for coming up with this plenary and the breakouts that you put together. I think it's been really, the Congressman was great, and it's going to be an exciting set of conversations the rest of this afternoon. I'm actually not going to repeat the key substantive points because I'm looking at this audience and seeing who you are and what you, the work you've been doing, many of you for decades, but I wanted to actually just make a couple strategic points sort of on a separate track about, why, from my perspective, discussing and studying issues of corporate finance and corporate governance is so central for labor and employment scholars writ large. So first, actually, a little bit of a separate point. I just wanted to build on the question that I asked the Congressman, and just encourage all of us who are thinking about these topics to ground our discussions of shareholder primacy in part on as a racial justice issue. When I'm giving presentations to students or to labor union folks, I usually start with just a few simple graphs from the distributional financial accounts that show how corporate equity is almost entirely held by white wealthy households. And that might be old hat for us, but the rhetoric of shareholder democracy is so deep, and I think has been even more reinforced in some ways by the meme stock bubble and sort of mythology right now about making money in the stock market. I have a paper that sort of looks at the fact that the gap in corporate equity ownership is actually a rising contributor to the overall racial wealth gap. We talk a lot about housing and, of course, workplace and wage discrimination as major drivers of racial income and wealth inequities. And of course, those are completely central and necessary to be studied. But I think that the topic of shareholder primacy and corporate equity ownership has been understudied. So I want that to be sort of a central framing point for all of us. And then really on a sort of entirely separate matter, I just wanted to give my perspective briefly that I think there is a real opening right now in politics, as difficult as, it's very difficult right now in lots of ways, but there's a rising generation of people in economic policy in the administration and Congress, scholars of law and political economy who are really my cohort, my community, who don't really see much of a disciplinary difference between labor, corporate finance, market power issues. And for us, we are, I'm the generation that was in graduate school during the great financial crisis. We're now in this next crisis, sort of living through the pandemic and supply chain crisis, looking at issues of reshoring and supply chain and production resilience. I think it's critically important for labor scholars to keep making the point to this rising cohort that workers' input is central to successful innovation and to solving the issues that we face in terms of supply chain and what production is actually going to look like going forward. I will make an even more very particular plug that I want to encourage all of you to teach your students to study corporate finance, teach them how to read a 10K, teach them how to read corporate financial documents, and to understand that the shareholder primacy model of the corporation is simply wrong, that we need a new framework for studying the political economy of the corporation, grounded in the theory of the corporation as an innovative enterprise. Bill and I are actually working on a new curriculum project that we'd love to involve people with, but I think that that type of teaching, at least within economics departments, even the heterodox ones, is still fairly lacking. Related, there's a reality in law schools that the progressives go into public law or labor law. In economics, those of us who sort of identify personally as progressives end up studying labor and stay away from financial economics. And so I want to, again, just encourage LERA members to push your progressive students to see finance as a place to do important economic analysis that will empower working people. For me, my labor economics professor and dissertation advisor, Teresa Ghilarducci, who's here, made this connection for me, and it set me on this course. That class was maybe 2006, and here I am. So I think we need to really be encouraging economists who are focused on issues of labor and working people to focus on the corporation. We'll be discussing on the session later in the afternoon about co-determination more specifically. I'm going to give a little bit of detail of how I've thought about questions of worker representation on boards, and I'd love to keep the conversation going on that particular topic there. And again, I just thank Michael, thank Bill and everyone for this conversation today. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Lenore. Looking at the clock, we got over 10 minutes, so I open it up to the audience. You can do the raise hand function. You can turn your microphone on, and we'll go one by one. Anyone? Well, we're waiting for folks to formulate something. Bill, I have a question for you. I want to highlight to the audience Bill's recent co-authored book, Predatory Value Extraction, came out about 2 years ago, that integrates and updates a flow of research and also theorizing on the topic that he's been doing for 30 years. Bill, just to reiterate one of the things that you emphasize in your book, use the word looting. And I think that, what I'm most provoked by when I read your work is sort of thinking about the narratives of capitalism that we have in our country right now. Capitalism is generally celebrated as a progressive force. And you kind of put the lie to that in terms of the current structure of capitalism. So could you reflect a little bit on your term looting?
Yeah, so it's how is value created? Value is created by people going to work and working together. You create more value, you generate innovation if you work collectively, cumulatively. And not only do people need careers, need long-term employment stability to earn a decent standard of living, that's how we develop our capabilities. Whatever education we come to the workforce with, it's the kind of work we do over years and years and decades that improves our capability, sustains our capability, working with other people. And that's what makes an economy productive. And so when some people come in who have nothing to do with this process of value creation, particularly the hedge fund activists, but you could say shareholders more generally, who just buy and sell shares, do not fund companies, and take that money and say, that's ours, that's looting. Now, and I would say that if you put CEOs in charge of these companies who say, oh, we're giving away all this money because there's nothing better to do with it, or whatever they're going to say about it, or we have to return value to shareholders when they never got money from shareholders, they're participating in the looting. And actually, they were first to the gate on this. It was really adopting stock-based executive pay, them buying into shareholder value ideology in the late 80s and early 90s that really got the thing going. And then the hedge funds or the corporate raiders built up more and more power. But they were there to loot because it meant that they didn't have to take responsibility for workers as they laid them off. And I'll just reiterate a point that Lenore made, because we've done it's on the website of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, basically a book. It's 5 working papers on what happened to African-American employment over the last, since the 1960s. And basically there was upward mobility among African-Americans in the 1960s and 70s, particularly at the blue-collar level, and overrepresentation in unions in this relative to the population. Those jobs were decimated, of course, for everybody ultimately, but it was blacks first. And after doing that study, I believe that if if it had been all white unionized labor force still, the reaction to unionization, Japanese competition, et cetera, in the 80s would have been very different. And and secondly, that shareholder value itself, the whole ideology of maximizing shareholder value, is racist ideology. And I'll just make one quick point. If you go look at the original of Milton Friedman's article in 1970 in New York Times, which is always cited, but if you go to look at the original, there is a picture of a person, a Black man, who is saying is a new worker who used to be homeless, underqualified, but now has this job. And that was put in there by the New York Times, but it's referenced in Friedman's article. He said people who, he doesn't say they're Black, but people who are unqualified, who used to be homeless, are now getting these skilled jobs and taking them away from qualified people. That was pitting whites against Blacks. Okay. And I think you can find lots and lots of examples of this.
Great. Yeah, I just want to highlight that in Bill Lazonick's recent book, and a lot of other literature, Margaret Blair is a pretty big name on this, is just a counter to the theory of shareholder primacy that came from Friedman in the Chicago School. We have two questions in the chat that I want to turn to. David Jacobs, you want to just turn your mic on and state your question?
I think I'm here, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for this panel. It's really fascinating. It's exciting in a variety of ways. My question is, we have some knowledge of German co-determination and the ways in which it has been very progressive, and yet there have been deficits in terms of actual use of the tools of worker representation. The fact that there is worker representation legally across the board doesn't mean that workers everywhere take advantage of it. I'm wondering if there is a particular feature of the system in Germany that needs to be tweaked to make sure that it's actually a guarantee of worker participation across the board. Thank you very much for taking the question.
Lenore, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, I would say that we should not think about, as a matter of sort of policy, adopting the German system in the United States, because we have a completely different industrial relations context. We have a completely different social context. But I think that the core question of how workers participate in the zone of entrepreneurial control is something that, you know, we should learn from the European experience, that it can be productive, not perfect, but that it's not completely out of bounds. And, you know, I think there's lots, I'm very much still learning from many people who have studied this for a long time about the German model, but I'm going to be talking at the panel that follows after the next breakout about some of the big questions that I think we have in conceptualizing the relationship between US labor law and US corporate law, and how worker representation on boards could actually be a benefit for worker organizing overall, not a cost. And I'll just plug, if I can, Wilma Liebman has a really excellent paper on this, and that she wrote that I love to share with people. So I'll also put that maybe in the chat if I can find the link quickly.
That'd be great. Is it Anton Aboud? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name. Do you want to?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. And it's a great panel discussion. I'm just curious, given the present political climate, including the makeup of the Supreme Court, what recommendations that are being made today would be most likely to come to reality? Anybody who wants to deal with that?
That's a tough one. I think we have to keep doing our work. We have to keep making the proposals, and we have to also support the people who are trying to make sure that we have a functioning democracy. But I think, you know, there's a lot of proposals right now that are about reshoring and innovation that are within the Commerce Department, within the administration, and also within the SEC that I think are, you know, possible successes in the near term, but we'll certainly see some of them go to the courts, and that's going to be tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long education process, as in all areas of American life, where people do not understand what's going on, and sometimes even people who should understand. I mean, the Congressman mentioned that now Peter DeFazio is supporting the Reward Work Act. I'm sure that came out of the fact that he led the investigation of Boeing. And even though in his is a huge investigation. They didn't give much play to the buybacks issue and the financialization of Boeing. They gave much less than they should have. Subsequently, when he was giving interviews, he was always focusing on this issue. So I think that's what he took away from it. So in some ways, it's the people who represent us, having this knowledge. And on the buybacks issue, there's been a huge amount of criticism that's come out of the U.S. Congress, and sometimes even from people who, people think I'm a consultant for them because they use my work, like Marco Rubio, because he has a guy named Julius Krein working for him who kind of understands this stuff, and so he's been a critic. The solutions are not that great, but at least there are a lot of people who are understanding that this is a problem, and that it's a problem because you're not investing in innovation, you're not investing in the working class, so I think there's been great progress on that particular front, much more than I would have thought. Now, whether that will translate into legislation, whether I have no idea how that will relate to, of course, the problems we have with the Supreme Court. That's a whole other level, it seems to me.
Thank you.
I want to put my 2 cents in on this point as well. I think one thing that I want to reiterate what Lenore was saying a few minutes ago about urging people to teach it to graduate students and undergraduate students. I think also to try and reach as broad an audience as possible, to write op-eds and do kind of things that I think a lot of people in LERA do, and maybe other contexts, PRO-ACT or something like that. It'd be really valuable. I think there's probably a very strong receptivity, but just a lack of knowledge. I mean, something like stock buybacks, the average human being is extremely abstract, but some of the stories that Bill, Lenore, and other researchers have put together really do illustrate it. I'm thinking of one of the really great books on structural racism that came out about 1.5 years ago, Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, which is a really accessible book for a pretty broad audience. Particularly the labor movement right now steers heavily towards young college-educated people who are interested in learning about things. I think there's a wide audience out there that we can continue to bring out. I think we're getting close to the time to wrap up. So let me make a couple of very brief closing remarks. I'll probably take about 2 minutes. I first want to invite people to attend the subsequent sessions, with all due respect to the concurrent sessions. In the next session, both Sandy Jacoby and Rose Batt, along with a young researcher, will be presenting their sort of seminal analyses on the subject. Subsequent panel to that will include Lenore Palladino talking about these corporate governance issues and policy, along with a paper co-authored by me and Rick McIntyre and Nina Eichacker. So I invite you to join all that. And then I guess I would just really strongly reiterate that I hope as many people as possible get as up to date as you can on the topic of corporate governance, because if political economy are the forces acting upon workers, I think financialization has proved to be a really tenacious and destructive force. And it has to be at the center of our thinking, both about research and policy. So thanks everyone for joining. It was a robust discussion. I think it was great to have Congressman Chuy García here. It's great to see somebody in Congress who's that conversant with all the issues and sees them in the right perspective. So please join us for those other events today. And again, I would still reiterate that there's a great body of writing done by Bill Lazonick, and then Lenore Palladino has a long series of reports from the Roosevelt Institute, recent journal articles, and of course her writing for the Boston Review is very accessible to a broad audience. I recommend all that to you. And thank you all for joining us today.